Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The disturbing life of Anne de Mowbray, the child Duchess missing for 400 years. One of the most shocking mysteries that still plagues English history today is the princes in the Tower. Inside the Tower of London, the heir apparent and child to succeed King Edward IV was his eldest son, Edward V. During the medieval time, the tradition was that before the coronation of the new king, the successor would have a short stay at the Tower of London as preparations were made for the coronation. Edward V, as he was a young boy, along with his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, were taken to the Tower and were placed under the stewardship of their uncle, Richard of Gloucester, who became Richard III. Richard was supposed to look after the young boys, his nephews. However, they disappeared under his watch. During this time, Richard would seize the throne for himself and would become King Richard III, with the two boys being declared illegitimate. It's mostly believed that the two boys were murdered on the orders of Richard III, and to further add to this theory, the remains of the two boys were found under a staircase in the White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London. But there is a disturbing part of the life of one of the princes in the Tower, and it's of Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York. Despite being around 10 when he was allegedly killed, he was actually technically a widow when he died. He was married to a young girl, a year older than him. But what is the story of this? Anne de Mowbray, the 8th Countess of Norfolk, was born on the 10th of December 1472 inside of Framlingham Castle. She was the only surviving child of John de Mowbray, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, and Lady Elizabeth Talbot. Her parents were very noble, and her father was a Knight of the Garter, and her mother was the daughter of John Talbot, the 1st Earl of Shrewsbury, and his second wife, Lady Margaret Beauchamp. This made Anne's grandfather one of the most celebrated military commanders in England. However, in 1476, Anne's father died, which left Anne at the age of around 3, being a very wealthy child and heiress. So Anne was incredibly wealthy, and her mother would have very little say in how her daughter's inheritance would be played out. But as she was so wealthy, Anne, despite being only an infant, began to become a target. Many noble men and earls and dukes across the country saw the wealth that she had, and they wished for their sons to marry her. Anne wasn't supposed to inherit the title and wealth, as this was usually left to the sons to claim, but King Edward IV made an exception. Anne's aunt, Lady Eleanor Talbot, vouched for her, and this was granted. However, the king would not let Anne de Mowbray and her wealth and lands pass to another man so easily. John Lord Howard had a good claim to the title of the Duke of Norfolk, and he hoped that he could marry one of his grandsons to Anne to strengthen his family's wealth and standing. He wished for his eldest grandson Thomas, who was around the same age as Anne, to marry her, and with this the Howards would take the wealth, title and lands. Howard was a loyalist to the House of York and had been knighted by King Edward IV at the Battle of Towton, and he served inside of the king's household. But the king would refuse the match and instead realised the value that marrying one of his own sons to Anne de Mowbray would have. On the 15th of February 1478, at the age of 5, Anne de Mowbray was shockingly married to Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York. Richard was just 4 years old, and he was the younger son of King Edward IV and his queen Elizabeth Woodville, and with this marriage the king's son would receive the massive dowry payment, meaning the king benefited greatly. But the marriage of the 5-year-old and 4-year-old caused a lot of scandal and shock. At the time, the church did not condone or allow marriages to take place of children so young, but it did allow for pre-contracts of marriage or engagements, as long as the child bride was not married until she was around the age of 12. But the king did not risk anything. He pushed through the marriage of Anne de Mowbray and his son to secure the lands and riches, and he could not risk something happening. If Anne died before she was married to Richard of Shrewsbury, then her cousin would have been the legal heir to the title in Norfolk. and also the land and wealth. By pushing through the marriage, this made Edward IV wealthy and secured his son this land. The thought of the 5-year-old Anne de Mowbray marrying the 4-year-old Prince Richard today is a very disturbing one, and even in the medieval period it was considered horrifying. But more disaster would come for Anne de Mowbray. It's assumed that the young girl had regular schooling for a girl of her standing. However, at Greenwich in London, on the 19th of November 1481, Anne de Mowbray died from what we must assume was an illness or disease that she contracted. She was just 8 years old when she died. As mentioned, normally her cousins would have been her heirs, but an Act of Parliament in January of 1483, shortly before the death of Edward IV, confirmed that it was her husband Richard, the king's 7-year-old son, who was vying the rights to the title, the land and the money. Anne de Mowbray, the 8-year-old princess, was then buried inside of a lead coffin, the chapel of St Erasmus of Formia, inside of Westminster Abbey. However, after the fall of the House of York and the ascension to the throne of the Tudors, Henry VII ordered the creation of a new chapel, the Henry VII Lady Chapel inside of Westminster Abbey. With this, the chapel where Anne was laid to rest was demolished, and her coffin was moved to a vault under the Abbey of the Minoresses of St Clair, without Aldgate, a church which was run by the nuns of the Order of Poor Clare's Franciscans, but then somehow Anne's coffin then disappeared, and it would be centuries before it actually returned back to its initial resting place. In the December of 1964, construction workers doing maintenance in Stepney accidentally dug and broke into the vault where Anne's coffin was laying. Her coffin was then broken into and opened, and inside lay the remains of the 8-year-old Duchess of York, Anne de Mowbray. It was said that her red hair was still present on her skull, and she was wrapped in a shroud. Following this, she was then taken back to Westminster Abbey 400 years after she was removed, and was then laid close to where it's believed her husband also rests. 2 years after the death of Anne de Mowbray, her husband Richard would go missing inside the Tower of London. In 1674, workmen created a new staircase inside the tower, and they found the bones of the 2 children, and these were believed to be Richard of Shrewsbury and his brother, the presumptive Edward V. Charles II ordered that these remains should be placed in the same church where kings were interred, and they were buried in an urn which bears the names Edward and Richard. But this does lead to the possibility that today, inside of some church, the bones of the child bride Anne and the child Prince Richard are united under the same roof. But the bones of the boys in the urn have never been proven to have been the princes in the tower. The life of Anne de Mowbray was rather tragic, as she was a pawn for the men in high medieval society, who just saw her as only useful for their titles that they could inherit through her, that she got from her father. She was just a young girl of 5 when she was married off to the king's son, and it's clear that the pair had no say in their marriage, and probably had no idea what they were doing. Anne was a tool for Edward IV to establish his wealth and power, and he did not want someone else to receive the money and influence that Anne had. Anne, during her short life, would lose her father, and also pass away being just an 8-year-old girl. Her story is an incredibly tragic one. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.